Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere most people have never been. Not a country, not a city, not even a coastline, just open water. Nothing in any direction but the horizon, and even that keeps pulling away from you no matter how long you sail toward it. No landmarks, no lighthouse, no signal from anywhere on Earth. Nothing but a few billion tons of restless ocean rolling out beneath you. And above you, if you're lucky, a sky so full of stars it seems almost cruel in its beauty. Almost like the universe is showing off when you have no idea which direction any of it points. And somehow, hundreds of years ago, pirates crossed it. Not by luck, not by accident. They crossed it again and again, in wooden ships with canvas sails, and they found what they were looking for on the other side. A specific cove on a specific island. A merchant vessel heavy with silver on a specific sea lane. A safe harbour where the authorities would never follow them through the reefs. They crossed open ocean and they survived it. And the methods they used to do that, the real methods, the forgotten ones, are so quietly brilliant that when you hear about them tonight, you are going to feel something close to wonder. Tonight we are talking about the forgotten art of pirate navigation. The tricks and the knowledge and the hard-won craft that kept men alive on the open sea during the golden age of piracy. Methods so sophisticated they have almost completely vanished from history, because we replaced them with electronics and forgot that human beings were once capable of reading the ocean the way you might read a book, the way you might read a face. That intimately, that fluently. Before we go any further, I want to say something genuine, as I always do. If you enjoy these long, quiet nights here on Dreamtoria, please take just a second to like the video and subscribe, not because I am watching the numbers, but because it genuinely helps this channel keep doing exactly what it is doing. Bringing you stories in the dark, in the quiet, when the world has finally stopped asking things of you. If you are new here, welcome. This is a place for people who wind down at night with history. People who like the feeling of the past being read to them softly, like a very long, very true bedtime story, which is exactly what this is. Drop a comment somewhere below telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is. I love knowing that. Someone in the south of France and someone in British Columbia are both lying in the dark right now, listening to the exact same words, and that quiet shared moment honestly moves me every time I think about it. You are not alone in this, even though the room you are in is quiet. Now, dim those lights if they are not already dim. Pull your blanket up just a little higher. If you have a fan running somewhere nearby, let it hum along. That soft white noise is exactly right for tonight. Get comfortable. Really comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your body settle into whatever it is resting on and allow itself to be heavy. The day is finished. You do not have to carry it anymore. And let me ask you something, now that you are still. Have you ever wondered how a pirate knew where he was when all he could see in every direction was water? How did he know which way to sail? How did he know how far he had travelled? How did he know, without GPS, without any satellite, without any of the technology we take completely for granted, that the island he had promised his crew was out there, just past the horizon, actually waiting for them? Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to stand at the wheel of a ship 300 miles from the nearest land, with the lives of 60 men behind you depending entirely on your knowledge, your memory, your ability to read a world that comes with no labels and no instructions? Have you ever thought about what those men actually knew? What they could smell and feel and see and hear that told them exactly where they were? What secrets they carried in their minds that they had learned from older sailors, who had learned from sailors before them, stretching back through centuries of hard-won ocean knowledge? And here is perhaps the most remarkable question of all. If all those instruments, all those satellites, all that technology disappeared tomorrow, how much of that ancient knowledge would still be findable? How much of it survived? Well, Tonight, we are going to find out. Because congratulations. You are standing on the quarterdeck of an 18th century pirate sloop somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The year is 1712. The night sky above you is so full of stars it does not look real. The ship is moving steadily, 8 or 9 knots, south and west, and the navigator, a quiet man with sun-darkened hands and 20 years of ocean memory living behind his eyes, is about to tell you everything he knows. The first thing you need to understand, before any of the tricks and the methods and the extraordinary knowledge we are going to explore tonight, is the scale of what these men were dealing with. Because nothing in modern life really prepares you for it. Nothing we do, nothing we see, nothing we drive or fly through or scroll past on a screen gives you the genuine felt sense of the open ocean from the deck of a small wooden ship. So let us spend a moment with the actual numbers. The Atlantic Ocean covers approximately 41 million square miles. 41 million. If you took the entire continent of North America and laid it down flat on the surface of the Atlantic, it would not come close to covering it. The Pacific is even larger, nearly twice the size, and in the golden age of piracy, which ran roughly from the 1680s through to the 1730s, men in wooden ships crossed these oceans and found specific islands in them, specific harbours, specific coves tucked behind headlands that looked like nothing from the sea, specific sea lanes where merchant ships would be at specific times of year. And they did all of that without a single piece of electronic equipment, without any technology more sophisticated than a compass, a length of knotted rope, a wedge of lead, and their own extraordinary accumulated knowledge. That knowledge is what we are talking about tonight. But to appreciate it, you first have to feel the scale of what they were sailing on. When you are out on the open ocean, really out, more than 200 miles from land in any direction, the ocean looks the same everywhere. Every degree of the compass points at more ocean. The horizon is perfectly circular, about 3 miles out in every direction, and that horizon never gets any closer no matter how long you sail toward it. The sea does not have signposts. It does not have mile markers. It does not change colour to tell you which part of it you are in, at least not obviously, not unless you know precisely what to look for. And knowing what to look for was literally the difference between life and death. A ship that lost its navigational bearings, that could not find land, that wandered on the open ocean without a clear sense of position, was a ship whose crew would die. Maybe from thirst, because the freshwater barrels ran out. Maybe from scurvy, because weeks without land meant weeks without fresh fruit, and the body without fresh food breaks down in ways that are slow and terrible and irreversible by the time anyone realizes what is happening. Maybe from weather, because storms found you more easily when you were not where you expected to be and did not know which direction shelter lay. Maybe, in the worst cases, from pure despair, because the psychological weight of being genuinely lost on the open ocean was something that broke men in ways no storm could. So navigation was not a theoretical skill. It was not an academic pursuit. It was survival. And for pirates specifically, it was something even more than survival. It was the difference between a successful raid and a blank horizon. A pirate ship that could not navigate precisely enough to find a specific cove on a specific island was not a pirate ship. It was a very expensive and very dangerous way to be lost. This is worth holding in your mind for a moment, because we sometimes imagine pirates as essentially lawless and reckless, as men who just sailed around wildly and happened to stumble into treasure. But the reality was almost the opposite. The most successful pirates were extraordinarily disciplined and precise in their navigation. They had to be. Their entire operation depended on it. You cannot intercept a merchant ship on a specific sea lane if you do not know exactly where that sea lane is. You cannot raid a Spanish port and escape safely if you do not know the exact route out through the reefs. You cannot hide in a remote Caribbean cove between raids if you cannot find the cove. The romance of piracy, the freedom, the defiance of authority, All of that was built on a foundation of careful, disciplined, expert knowledge of the ocean. Without the knowledge, there was no piracy. There was only getting lost and dying. The golden age of piracy coincided almost exactly with one of the most remarkable and also most frustrating periods in the history of navigation. Navigators of this era had solved one of the two great problems of ocean sailing, and they were completely and humiliatingly stumped by the other one. The problem they had solved was latitude. Latitude is your position north or south of the equator. Expressed as a number of degrees, where 0 degrees is the equator, 90 degrees north is the North Pole, and every number in between describes a line circling the Earth parallel to the equator. By the early 1700s, sailors had been able to calculate their latitude with reasonable accuracy for over 200 years. The tools and methods for this were imperfect and sometimes required a degree of courage, given that earlier versions involved looking directly at the sun without adequate protection for your eyes. But the basic principle had been mastered, and we will talk about exactly how it worked in the next section. Longitude was a completely different problem. And not just harder, fundamentally, philosophically different. Longitude is your position east or west. And the reason figuring it out is so much harder than figuring out latitude is that the Earth, when it comes to east and west, has no natural reference point equivalent to the equator or the poles. North and south have a meaningful physical reference. The Earth spins on its axis, and the poles are where the axis meets the surface. But east and west? The Earth is a sphere. Every point on it is just as much east or west as any other point. There is no natural prime meridian. The choice of 0 degrees longitude is arbitrary. Greenwich, England, is 0 degrees longitude only because British mapmakers said so, and the world eventually agreed. More crucially, finding your longitude required knowing the time. Specifically, you needed to compare your local time, which you could determine from the position of the sun, with the time at a location of known longitude. The difference between those two times told you how far east or west you were of that known location. 1 hour of time difference equals 15 degrees of longitude. But in 1712, there was no clock in existence that could keep accurate time on a ship. A rolling, pitching, constantly changing temperature ship. Pendulum clocks, which were the most accurate clocks of the era on land, lost or gained minutes just from the motion of the hull. The swinging of the pendulum was affected by the swinging of the ship in ways that were simply impossible to compensate for. Spring-driven clocks fared slightly better, but were still wildly unreliable over a voyage of weeks or months. And a clock that is off by 4 minutes makes a navigational error of 60 nautical miles at the equator. 60 miles of empty ocean where you expected open water can turn out to be where a reef is waiting. This problem was not solved until 1759, when a Yorkshire clockmaker named John Harrison finally built a marine chronometer accurate enough to maintain proper time at sea. His fourth chronometer, a small, beautiful, precise instrument roughly the size of a large pocket watch, was tested on a voyage to Jamaica in 1761. After 81 days at sea, in all the heat and humidity of a tropical crossing, it was off by only 5 seconds. 5 seconds of time error. That corresponds to a positional error of less than 2 miles. That clock changed the history of the world. It made precise navigation finally possible. But in 1712, that clock did not exist yet. The Longitude Prize, the enormous financial reward offered by the British Parliament for anyone who could solve this problem, would not even be officially established until 1714. The pirate navigators of the Golden Age were sailing in the gap, the long, anxious historical gap before the solution existed. They were navigating east and west largely by educated inference, by a method called dead reckoning, by the accumulated experience of specific routes travelled multiple times, and by tricks and forms of knowledge that are not in any textbook, that were passed between sailors orally, guarded jealously, and that almost completely disappeared when the age that needed them ended. There is one more thing you need to understand about the instruments these navigators actually had, because there is a tendency to imagine pirates with almost nothing at all, and that is not quite accurate. The well-equipped navigator in the early 1700s had access to several tools: a compass, almost certainly, some form of angle measuring instrument, either a cross-staff or a backstaff or an early quadrant, printed tables that told him the sun's position in the sky for each day of the year, which helped him convert noon sun observations into latitude, a lead line for measuring depth and reading the seafloor, a chip log and knotted rope for measuring the ship's speed, charts, though charts of this era were often fantastically inaccurate, showing coastlines in the wrong places, leaving entire islands off, misrepresenting depths in ways that got ships killed. And that was essentially it. Every other piece of navigational knowledge lived in the navigator's head, in his memory, in what he had spent years learning from the men who taught him. The extraordinary thing about pirate navigation is not the instruments, it is the knowledge, the accumulated human intelligence about how the ocean works and how the sky works and how the wind moves and how living things behave near land and far from it. That knowledge was the real navigation technology of the Golden Age. And most of it is gone now, or nearly gone. We stopped needing it when we invented better machines, and so we stopped teaching it, and so it faded. But tonight, we are going to bring some of it back. There is something worth pausing on here before we go any further. Something about what it actually meant to carry this knowledge, to be the person who had it in a world where so few people did. A navigator in the early 1700s was not simply a skilled professional in the way we use that phrase today. He was something closer to the keeper of a secret language, a language in which the sky spoke and the ocean spoke, and the birds spoke and the wind spoke, and he was one of a relatively small number of people alive who could hear and understand all of it fluently. Other sailors could feel a storm coming. A captain could hold a compass course and read a rough chart. But to truly navigate, to know where you were on the surface of the ocean at any given moment, to carry that knowledge continuously and confidently across thousands of miles of open water, that was a rarer gift. And the men who had it knew it, and the men who worked beside them knew it too. There was a particular quality of quiet authority that good navigators were described as having, across many accounts from this era. Not the loud authority of a captain who commanded through fear or charisma, something more internal, the kind of authority that comes from being the person in the room who simply knows something that no one else knows. You could ask a good navigator where the ship was, and he would tell you, not with guesswork wrapped in confidence, with actual knowledge, earned through thousands of hours of study and observation and practice. And in a world where that question, where are we, was the most important question anyone on the ship could ask, the person who could answer it occupied a very particular kind of power. The good navigators had something else too, something that is harder to name. They had a calibrated relationship with their own uncertainty. They knew exactly how reliable their current estimate of position was, and they knew exactly what was making it less reliable with every passing hour. They knew how many days had gone by since the last confirmed latitude observation, and therefore how much dead reckoning error had had time to build up. They knew when to express confidence, and when to say I am less certain of this than I would like. That honesty, that precise self-knowledge about the limits of what they knew, was itself a navigational skill, because the navigator who was always certain, who never admitted doubt, was the most dangerous kind. He would walk a ship onto a reef and be surprised by it. And then they slept. That is perhaps the detail that stays with me most, thinking about these men. They did all of this, carried all of this responsibility, held all those lives in their navigational hands, and then they went below and slept. The body required it, and there is something almost beautiful about the trust implied in that act. The navigator lying down in his bunk and closing his eyes, trusting the watch to hold the course, trusting the helmsman to keep the bearing he had set, trusting the world to stay more or less where he had left it while he rested for a few hours. And mostly it did. Mostly, they woke up roughly where they had expected to wake up. And mostly, that was enough. The first thing our navigator would have done every single clear night was look up, and what he did with what he saw above him was something that those of us who have grown up under electric skies can barely imagine. The sky above an 18th century ship at sea was a completely different thing from the sky you see tonight. Even on the clearest night from the darkest place you have ever stood, if you are anywhere near human civilization, you are seeing a diminished version. Light pollution steals most of it. The faint stars disappear into the glow. The Milky Way is barely visible. The sky looks thin and two-dimensional, a black surface with a few bright points scattered across it. But on the open ocean in 1712, 100 miles from any coast, with no cities, no fires, no electric lights of any kind anywhere within range, the sky was overwhelming. Sailors who tried to describe it used words that sounded like exaggeration, but were not. They described it as dizzying, as terrifying in its beauty, as something that made you feel very small and very mortal, and at the same time strangely, unexpectedly at home. The Milky Way was not a faint smear across the middle of the sky. It was a solid band of silver light bright enough to cast shadows on the deck. On the best nights, you could read a chart by it. You could see a man's face from 20 feet. You could count individual stars in clusters that appeared, from anywhere near land, as a single point. And the most important star in that sky, at least for anyone sailing in the northern hemisphere, was a star that most people have heard of, even if they have never used it for anything. Polaris, the North Star. You probably know the North Star exists. You may know in a general way that sailors used it. But do you know why it works? Because the reason it works is one of those things that, once you truly understand it, makes the universe feel slightly more designed for human use than it has any right to be. The Earth spins on its axis. That axis is not perfectly upright relative to the plane of the solar system. It tilts at about 23.5 degrees. But more importantly for our purposes tonight, the axis points in a particular direction in space, and it just so happens, by what seems like a remarkable piece of cosmic coincidence, that the axis of the Earth points almost exactly at a particular star in the constellation Ursa Minor. Not exactly. About 3/4 of a degree away from exactly, but close enough to be extraordinary. Because of this, every other star in the sky traces a circle around Polaris as the night progresses. They rise in the east and set in the west, completing their circles in 24 hours as the Earth turns beneath them. But Polaris, the star that the Earth's axis is almost pointing at, barely moves. It sits there nearly motionless, while everything else rotates around it. The whole enormous sky pivots around this one still point, all night, every night, all year, and has been doing so for as long as human beings have been able to look up. Here is the beautiful mathematical truth at the heart of all of this. The angle between Polaris and the horizon is exactly equal to your latitude. Exactly if you are standing at the North Pole, Polaris is directly overhead, straight up, 90 degrees above the horizon, and 90 degrees north is the North Pole. If you are standing on the equator, Polaris sits right on the horizon, 0 degrees above it, and 0 degrees north is the equator. If you are anywhere between, Polaris is at some angle between 0 and 90 degrees, and that angle is your latitude. Your distance north of the equator, expressed in degrees, is the same number as Polaris's height above your horizon. This means that to find your latitude in the northern hemisphere, all you need to do is measure the angle between Polaris and the horizon. One measurement. One number. And you know where you are in the north-south dimension of the world. Not perfectly, not down to the mile, but to within about a degree, which is roughly 60 nautical miles, which for most navigational purposes in that era was remarkably good. The instrument most pirate navigators used for this measurement was called a cross-staff. It is an elegant piece of technology, deceptively simple in its construction, and surprisingly effective in skilled hands. The cross-staff is a wooden rod about 3 feet long, sometimes longer, with a shorter piece of wood, the crosspiece, that can slide back and forth along it at a right angle, forming a cross shape as the name suggests. To use it, you hold the long end up to your eye, almost like a spyglass or a telescope. You look along the rod toward the horizon. You slide the crosspiece back and forth until one end of it lines up with the horizon below and the other end of it lines up with the star you are trying to measure. The angle between the horizon and the star is then readable from a scale of marks carved into the long rod where the crosspiece intersects it. The whole process takes about 30 seconds once you know what you are doing. Not a single electric component. Not a battery or a circuit or a processor. Just 2 pieces of wood and 20 years of practice. But there was a problem with the cross staff when it came to measuring the sun during the day rather than stars at night. You had to look directly into the sun to align the crosspiece. This was, as you might imagine, quite bad for your eyes. Sailors who spent years doing noon sights with a cross staff frequently developed serious eye damage. Some went partially blind from the accumulated exposure. The older a navigator got, sometimes the worse his instrument for doing the most important daily measurement of his job. Which is why, in the 1590s, an English navigator and explorer named John Davis invented something better. He called it the backstaff, and the genius of it is obvious the moment you hear the name. You turn your back to the sun. Instead of looking at the blazing disk in the sky directly, you stand with the sun behind you, and you use the shadow it casts through the instrument's vane to make the same measurement. You align the shadow with the horizon in front of you, reading your angle from a scale. No blinding. No squinting into light that destroys your eyes. You can make the same measurement in comfort and safety with your back to the light source. Davis was a remarkable person in his own right. He made 3 voyages attempting to find the Northwest Passage through Arctic Canada, surviving conditions that killed most of his companions, and he wrote a book called The Seaman's Secrets that was used as a teaching text for nearly a century after his death. Pirates who had learned their craft from naval or merchant ships often knew Davis's methods without ever having heard his name. There were other instruments too. The quadrant was a quarter circle of brass or wood, with a plumb line hanging from the corner where the 2 straight edges met, and an arc of scale along the curved edge. You sighted the star or horizon along one straight edge, and the plumb line hanging straight down under the pull of gravity showed you the angle on the scale. The astrolabe, older still, was a flat disc of engraved metal that could be suspended from a ring at the top, rotated to different positions, and used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies with remarkable precision on land. At sea, the constant rolling and pitching of a wooden ship made the astrolabe nearly useless, the suspension ring swinging and spinning, the measurement dancing around its true value. But determined sailors used it anyway, in the calmer moments, waiting for the brief stability between wave crests. And some sailors, particularly those who had spent decades at sea and trusted their own bodies over any instrument, used nothing but their hands. Hold your hand up at arm's length, and the width of your 4 fingers spans roughly 7 degrees of sky. The span from thumb tip to little finger with your hand spread wide is about 20 degrees. The width of a single thumb is about 2 degrees. A navigator who had spent years at sea and knew these ratios for his own particular hand could estimate the angle of Polaris above the horizon without touching any instrument at all, and be accurate to within 2 or 3 degrees, which was often close enough for the purpose at hand. But the North Star only helps you in the northern hemisphere. As you sail south, Polaris sinks toward the horizon. It gets lower and lower as your latitude decreases. Cross the equator, and Polaris disappears below the horizon entirely. In the southern hemisphere, you have a completely different sky, a sky that most European sailors of the early colonial era had never seen before they crossed the equator, and that initially disoriented them profoundly. No familiar constellations where they expected to find them, no North Star to anchor everything else around. What the southern hemisphere has instead, and what Pacific and Indian Ocean navigators had been using for thousands of years before any European ship ventured south of the equator, was the Southern Cross. Crux, as it is formally named, is a constellation of 4 bright stars arranged in the distinctive shape of a cross, with one star slightly off to the side completing the form. The two stars that make up the long axis of the cross, the head and the foot of it, point in the direction of the south celestial pole. The technique for using the Southern Cross to find your southerly latitude is more complex than simply measuring the altitude of a pole star. Because the cross rotates around the southern pole as the night progresses and is not always in a convenient orientation, experienced navigators learned to compensate for this rotation, knew which position of the cross in the sky required which correction to the measurement, and could work out their latitude in the southern hemisphere with accuracy comparable to what northern sailors achieved with Polaris. Beyond latitude, the night sky gave navigators other kinds of information that were less precise but still genuinely useful. The time of year was readable from which constellations were visible. Because the Earth moves around the Sun over the course of a year, different parts of the sky face away from the Sun at night in different seasons. And different constellations are therefore visible at different times of year. A navigator who had learnt the sky properly could look up on a clear night and know within a few weeks what time of year it was, even if he had lost track of the date. The sky was a calendar, and time of year was navigational information in the sense that it told you what weather to expect, which trade wind patterns were currently active, which passages were best attempted at this season, and which were better left for another time. Individual stars rising on the horizon carried directional information too. Different stars rise at different points along the eastern horizon, depending on their position in the sky, relative to the celestial equator. A star that rises due east will always rise due east, every single night, from every point on Earth. Several stars did this reliably enough that navigators memorized them and could orient themselves on a starry night even without a compass. The three stars of Orion's belt, one of the most recognizable patterns in the sky, rise almost exactly due east and set almost exactly due west. Anywhere in the world, if you can see Orion's belt rising, you know which way east is. If you can see it setting, you know which way west is. For free, with no instruments required. When the clouds came, all of this vanished. There were nights, sometimes many nights in succession, when thick cloud covered the entire sky from horizon to horizon, and not a single star broke through. Days when the sun hid behind grey overcast from dawn to dark. After 3 or 4 such days, the navigator who had been keeping position by his noon sights and his nightly Polaris measurements was now navigating entirely by dead reckoning, by calculation and inference, with no fresh astronomical observation to confirm or correct his estimate of where the ship was. Those were the days that tested the other skills, the skills that did not require the sky at all. On a clear day, the most important moment in a navigator's working day was noon. Not noon on a clock, because clocks at sea were unreliable, and the ship likely had no accurate one. Noon in the sense of the sun's highest point, the moment when the sun stopped climbing in the sky and began to descend. You could find this moment by watching the sun through the backstaff or the crossstaff and noting when it ceased to rise. When the sun stopped climbing, you had found local noon, and the angle of the sun at that exact moment, combined with a correction from a table that told you the sun's position for that day of the year, gave you your latitude. The correction table was necessary because of the same reason that your noon sight gives different answers in summer and winter, even from the same place. The Earth is tilted on its axis, and this tilt means that the sun is higher in the summer sky and lower in the winter sky. The sun's position changes through the year, and its maximum height at noon on a given latitude is different on the 21st of June than it is on the 21st of December. The published tables told navigators how to correct for this, giving them the sun's celestial latitude, its declination, for every day of the year. Armed with a noon sight and the appropriate declination value, a navigator could calculate his latitude. A navigator who had been at sea long enough and trusted his own experience sometimes did this in his head, correcting for the day's declination from memory, without consulting any table, making his estimate with his accumulated sense of what the sun should be doing at this time of year. The best pilots knew the sun's seasonal behaviour the way a farmer knows his own fields, but latitude, as we have established, was only half the story. You could know exactly how far north or south of the equator you were. You still had almost no reliable way of knowing how far east or west. And this was where dead reckoning came in. Dead reckoning is the art of estimating your current position by starting from a known position and calculating where you must have travelled since then. You need three things: a direction from your compass, a speed from your log, and a time from a sandglass or the sun. Combine them, and in theory you know how far you have gone in which direction, and therefore where you are now relative to where you were. The compass was the oldest of these tools. Magnetic compasses had been used in European navigation since at least the 12th century, possibly earlier. By the golden age of piracy they were well understood and reasonably reliable instruments, but they came with a complication that was serious enough to have killed sailors who did not understand it. Compasses do not point to the geographic North Pole, they point to the magnetic North Pole, which is in a completely different location from the geographic pole, and which, moreover, moves over time as the magnetic field of the Earth slowly shifts. The difference between magnetic north and true north is called magnetic variation, and it is different in different parts of the world. In the middle of the Atlantic, it might be 5 or 10 degrees. Near the coast of North America, it could be 20 degrees or more. A 20-degree error in your compass heading, sustained over 1,000 miles of sailing, puts you about 350 miles from where you think you are. 350 miles of ocean that looks exactly like the ocean where you intended to be. Experienced navigators knew the variation for the waters they usually sailed. They corrected for it instinctively, adjusting their courses the way a driver automatically steers into a crosswind without consciously thinking about it. But in unfamiliar waters, magnetic variation was a source of serious, sometimes deadly error. Speed was measured with a device called the chip log, and this is where we get a piece of language that we still use today without thinking about where it came from. The chip log was a flat piece of wood, roughly triangular, weighted at one point so that it would sit upright in the water and resist being dragged along by the ship's motion. Attached to the chip log was a long line of rope, and in this rope, at regular intervals of exactly 47 feet and 3 inches, there was a knot tied. When you wanted to measure your speed, you threw the chip log overboard off the stern, let it settle in the water where it sat still while the ship moved away from it, and let the rope run out freely over the rail. You counted how many knots passed through your hands over a period of exactly 28 seconds, timed with a small sandglass. However many knots ran out in those 28 seconds was your speed in nautical miles per hour. Which is why, to this day, we measure ship speed in knots. The actual literal knots in the actual literal rope gave us the word. Every time a weather forecaster says the wind is blowing at 30 knots, they are speaking a word that came from a knotted rope on the stern of a wooden ship. The measurement was approximate, sometimes quite rough. How fast the rope ran through your fingers depended partly on how firmly you gripped it, and sailors with calloused hands gripped differently from sailors who had been at sea only a few months. The sandglass was not always accurate. The chip log itself was affected by the turbulence of the ship's wake, and most crucially, the chip log measured the ship's speed through the water, not its speed over the ground. These are different things, and the difference between them was a constant source of dead reckoning error. Ocean currents were the great hidden variable in every dead reckoning calculation, and experienced navigators spent enormous effort trying to account for them. In the North Atlantic, the dominant current system is the Gulf Stream. This vast river of warm water sweeps out of the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Strait, runs northeast along the American coast, and then bends eastward across the Atlantic toward Europe. At its core, the Gulf Stream moves at 3 to 4 knots. Consider what that means. A ship sailing northeast along the American coast, measuring its speed through the water at 6 knots, might actually be covering 9 or 10 knots over the ground, carried by the current. Or, if sailing in the wrong direction relative to the stream, might be effectively making only 2 or 3 knots of actual progress, despite sailing hard. Over a week at sea, this difference became a navigational disaster. You arrived 100 miles from where you expected. Sometimes 200. Pirates who operated regularly in the Western Atlantic knew the Gulf Stream intimately. They could detect it by the colour of the water, which became a distinctive deep blue in the Gulf Stream's core. They could feel it in the temperature, the Gulf Stream water being noticeably warmer than the surrounding ocean. They used it deliberately when it helped them travel faster, and they consciously fought against it or steered around it when it would throw their dead reckoning off. That knowledge had been earned over years of experience, over multiple voyages, over the accumulated intelligence of watching what the current did to their ships and their calculations and their arrivals. All of this was written down, as well as possible, in the ship's log, not a journal in the personal sense, a navigational record. Every watch of 4 hours, every helmsman and every navigator wrote down the compass heading, the speed from the most recent ship log measurement, the wind direction and strength, the weather, the state of the sea, any significant events. This created a running record that let the navigator trace back through the previous days and calculate his position by dead reckoning at any given moment. You started from the last certain fix, the last time you had taken a reliable latitude observation or had identified a piece of land you recognized, and you worked forward from there through the log's records. The trouble was that errors accumulated. Each small inaccuracy in compass heading, each slightly off chip log reading, each current that was a bit stronger or weaker than estimated, added together over days and weeks of sailing. A navigator who had been 3 weeks at sea since his last confirmed position might know his latitude reasonably well from his noon sights, but his longitude, his east-west position, could be off by 100 miles or more from dead reckoning alone. And on a featureless ocean, 100 miles of longitude error is completely invisible. The sea looks exactly the same. The sky looks exactly the same. The horizon sits in the same place in every direction. You could be exactly where your dead reckoning says you are, or you could be 100 miles east or west of that, and nothing you could see from the deck would tell you which. This is precisely why the supplementary methods mattered so much. The sky told you your latitude. Dead reckoning estimated your longitude with variable accuracy. But the ocean itself, the living, breathing, physical ocean around the ship, could tell an experienced navigator things that no instrument and no calculation could match. And it is these methods, the ones that lived in sailors' senses rather than their instruments, that have most completely disappeared from the modern world. And before we get to those methods, I want you to feel for a moment what dead reckoning actually felt like as a lived experience, not as a mathematical concept, as a human experience sustained over days and weeks. Because the mathematics of it, the arithmetic of course plus speed plus time, takes a few seconds to describe. But living it, being the person responsible for it, day after day, through fog and rain and long cloudy stretches when the sky refused to cooperate, that was something quite different. Imagine it this way. You are 3 weeks out from Tortuga. You have not had a clear sky in 5 days. You have been running north-northwest in moderate trade winds at 7 knots, your compass showing roughly 320 on the dial, and you have made your calculations. According to your dead reckoning, you should be about here, and you mark the position on the chart with a careful pencil cross, knowing even as you mark it that the cross is an estimate, not a fact. You have tried to account for the Gulf Stream, which you crossed 2 days ago by the feel of the water temperature, and you have made an adjustment for that. You have noticed that the last 2 days the wind backed slightly south, which tends to put the ship a few degrees west of her compass heading. You have adjusted for that too. Your estimate has been built up from a dozen small corrections layered on top of each other, each one reducing the error a little, and together they give you a position that you genuinely believe is within 50 miles of the truth. Maybe within 30. But 50 miles is 50 miles. And somewhere in those 50 miles there might or might not be land. There is an island that should be roughly here, and you need to find it, because the water barrels are 3 weeks into a 6-week supply, and the men need fresh water and fresh food. You need to find it. but you cannot tell the captain with certainty where it is, because your dead reckoning, however carefully built, cannot be certain. You can tell him where your best estimate puts it, and he has to decide whether to trust that estimate, and how hard to push the ship toward it, and whether to send lookouts up the mast, and whether to feel relieved or worried about what they will report when they get there. All of that decision-making rests on the cross you made in pencil on the chart, and on the quality of the knowledge and care that went into placing it there. That is what dead reckoning felt like from the inside. That is why the navigator's job was not just technical. It was deeply human. The anxiety of uncertainty held close and not shared, because sharing it in full would panic a crew that had its own fears to manage. The responsibility of being the person who knew best how uncertain everything was. The skill of making decisions that were better than random even when the information was imperfect. And of being right enough, often enough, that the ship kept arriving where it needed to be. This is precisely why the supplementary methods mattered so much. There is a quality of attention that comes from spending years at sea that is almost impossible to explain to people who have never left sight of land for more than a few hours. It is a particular kind of presence, a total engagement with the environment, that comes from knowing at some deep survival level that the environment is the only information available to you. Every detail matters. Every change matters. Every smell and sound and colour and texture and temperature shift is a piece of data that your trained attention collects and processes and files away. And the ocean is absolutely full of information if you know how to receive it. Start with colour. The colour of the ocean changes constantly, and the changes are meaningful in ways that a trained eye reads as automatically as you read the colour of a traffic light. In the deep open ocean, far from any shore, the water is a particular shade of blue. Not the blue of a swimming pool or a painted wall. A very specific, very deep, almost indigo blue that comes from the way pure water absorbs red light and scatters blue. That colour means depth. It means you are in water that is thousands of feet deep, possibly more than a mile. It means there is nothing below you for a distance that the human mind cannot really comprehend. As you approach a continental shelf, where the ocean floor rises toward the surface over the relatively flat margin of a continent, the colour changes. It lightens. The deep indigo shifts toward a brighter, cleaner blue. Then toward turquoise. Then, in the very shallow water of a lagoon or a bank, toward green or aquamarine or near a beach of white sand. Almost white. The change is gradual, not a sharp line, but an experienced navigator looking off the bow could tell you the approximate depth from the colour alone. He had seen these transitions in these sequences so many times that the shift from deep indigo to lighter blue was as clear a signal to him as a road sign. Caution, the water is getting shallower. Prepare to sound. This mattered for the obvious reason that shallow water contained rocks and reefs that could tear a wooden ship apart, but it also mattered for navigation, because certain colour zones corresponded to certain geographic features that appeared in no other way. The turquoise shallows of the Great Bahama Bank have a quality of colour unlike any other shallow water in the Atlantic. A navigator who knew those waters knew that specific shade of pale blue-green meant he was on the bank, and could estimate his position within a broad area just from the colour of the water around him. The colour also revealed what was in the water. Near the mouths of large rivers, the ocean becomes brown or greenish from the sediment and organic material the river carries. The Amazon River pours such an enormous volume of fresh water and river sediment into the western Atlantic that the change in water colour and quality is detectable more than 100 miles offshore. A ship approaching the South American coast from the northeast might encounter this river-stained water long before seeing any sign of land at all, before any bird, before any change in the depth, before any visible coast. The brownish colour and the freshened taste of the water, and yes, sailors routinely tasted the ocean water around their ships, told the navigator he was approaching the mouth of a great river, and there was only one great river on that coast. That knowledge placed him on the chart. The smell was often even earlier than the colour. Fresh water smells different from salt water. It carries with it the smell of soil, of vegetation, of the organic richness of a vast tropical forest. Sailors on ships approaching the mouths of large tropical rivers described smelling the land before they could see any change in the water at all. The Amazon's smell was famous among those who had encountered it. A faint sweetness in the air, mixed with something green and growing and ancient, that built gradually as you approached and was unmistakable once you recognized it. Different coasts had different smells. Experienced navigators who had travelled the same waters repeatedly built up a catalogue of those smells, the way a wine taster builds up a catalogue of what different grapes from different soils and different years smell like. That catalogue was information. It was positional. Forests and vegetation on islands had their own perfumes. Tropical islands, dense with flowering trees and undergrowth, and the particular organic richness of soil that had been building for centuries, produced a complex smell that could drift out to sea for 20 or 30 miles on the right wind. Pirates approaching a known island in darkness or in poor visibility sometimes smelled it before any other indicator appeared. An instruction passed quietly to the watch. Smell anything? And sometimes the answer was yes. Something green and sweet on the wind. Faint, but there, the particular signature of that island's vegetation. And the navigator adjusted his course accordingly. Temperature mattered too, in the felt and instinctive way rather than the measured way. Tropical ocean water was warm, obviously, and subtropical water was less warm, and the change in temperature as you moved between these zones was felt in the water that came over the bow, in the spray, in the feel of the sea around the ship. Cold water upwellings, places where deep cold water rose toward the surface, driven by wind and current patterns, were noticeably colder than the surrounding ocean. Stick your hand over the side and the difference was felt immediately. And upwellings meant rich feeding grounds, concentrations of plankton and small fish, and everything that fed on them and everything that fed on that. A navigator who felt the bucket of seawater he had drawn up coming up distinctly colder than expected was in a different kind of water, and different kinds of water in the ocean corresponded to different kinds of places. Seaweed was another source of location information. Different seaweeds grew in different parts of the ocean, and their presence on or near the surface told a navigator things about where he was that no starsight could confirm. The Sargasso Sea, a vast area of relatively calm water in the middle of the North Atlantic, bounded by the Gulf Stream to the west and north, and by other current systems on the other sides, is named for the sargassum seaweed that floats on its surface in enormous golden brown mats. Sargassum does not anchor to the seafloor. It floats freely, reproducing in the water, forming island-like masses that can be thick enough to slow a ship's passage through them. A sailor who found himself surrounded by extensive sargassum knew he was in or near the Sargasso Sea, which told him his approximate position in the Atlantic without requiring any instrument at all. Giant kelp was different. It grew in cold water, anchored to the seafloor in relatively shallow water along certain coasts. Kelp drifted offshore sometimes, and finding it at the surface suggested cold water and a coast somewhere upwind. The coasts of California, of South America from Cape Horn northward along the Pacific side, of southern Africa, were all cold water kelp coasts. A navigator approaching the Cape of Good Hope from the south, who found himself in kelp-strewn water, knew he was close to the southern tip of Africa. Floating wood and vegetation told the most specific story of all. A log floating in the ocean accumulates marine growth on its underside as it drifts, and the density of that growth is roughly proportional to how long the log has been in the water. A log covered with barnacles and weed has been drifting for months or years. But a fresh log, still with its bark on, still with green leaves attached, had entered the ocean very recently. Very recently meant it came from land that was very close, land close enough for a recently cut or fallen tree to have reached the sea and not yet travelled far. Look at the current. Look at the direction the log is drifting from. Follow the reverse of that direction, and you are heading toward land. Floating river-borne material told a more specific story still. Cut reeds, leaf litter, coconut shells still with fresh husks, the particular floating debris associated with rivers and their banks meant a river mouth was nearby. Rivers flowed from specific directions off specific coasts. A navigator who could identify which kind of river debris he was seeing and knew which coast rivers of that kind flowed from had learned his position from a piece of drifting vegetable matter. And in tropical and subtropical waters, on certain nights the ocean itself seemed to glow. Bioluminescence, the light produced by billions of tiny dinoflagellate organisms disturbed in the water. A ship moving through a patch of dense dinoflagellates left a glowing wake behind it, the churned water at the bow lit with shifting blue-green fire, the turbulence at the stern streaming out in a trail of cold light that sometimes lasted for minutes. Every splash of the hull produced sparks of blue. This was magnificent to see, and well known to every sailor who had spent time in warm water. It also carried navigational information. Dense bioluminescence meant you were in warm, productive, well-lit surface water, the kind associated with the tropics and subtropics. Its sudden appearance when you had been in darker water, or its sudden disappearance when you entered different water, was a flag that the character of the ocean around you had changed. On the surface itself, certain patterns in the way waves moved and chop built up revealed the presence of features below that were not otherwise visible. A shallow bank, a reef, a drowned volcano lying beneath the surface changes the movement of the ocean above it. Waves passing over a shallow area shorten and steepen. The surface looks different, choppier, less regular, more confused than the open ocean on either side. A trained eye watching the water ahead could sometimes detect a submerged hazard from this signature on the surface before the depth changed enough to register on the lead line. This was not foolproof. Ships still ran aground with terrible frequency. But the skill was real, and it saved lives. And this is as good a moment as any to talk about the lead line itself, because it was one of the most practically important instruments a navigator had, and it worked on a principle so simple and so elegant that it had barely changed in 3,000 years of use. The lead line was a rope, marked at regular intervals with pieces of leather and cloth of different shapes, so they could be identified by touch in the dark. Attached at the bottom to a weight of lead heavy enough to sink quickly to the seafloor in the shallow water where sounding was most needed. The marks were at specific depths: 2 fathoms, 3 fathoms, 5, 7, 10, 13, 15, 17, 20. A fathom was 6 feet, approximately the span of a person's arms, and the depths were called by the leadsman reading the marks by the mark 5, meaning 5 fathoms, 30 feet. By the deep 6, meaning 6 fathoms with no mark, estimated by feel. And the phrase that has come down to us from this practice, the literary alias taken by a Missouri river pilot named Samuel Clemens, who spent years calling depths on the Mississippi, by the Mark Twain, 2 fathoms, 12 feet, the minimum safe depth for the river steamboats of his era. But the depth measurement was only part of what the lead line told you. The bottom of the lead weight was hollowed out and packed with tallow, with animal fat. When the lead struck the seafloor, sediment stuck to the tallow. When the lead was pulled back up, you examined what was in the tallow very carefully. Sand, and if so what colour and texture, fine or coarse. White or grey or black. Mud, and if so what consistency, firm or soft, and what colour. Shell, and if so what kind, small and whole or broken and crushed. Gravel, small stones, a mixture. These details were recorded in the log, and they were compared against what the charts showed for various areas. The charts of well-surveyed waters from this era noted seafloor composition everywhere they recorded depths. Fine grey sand at 15 fathoms, dark muddy bottom at 30, shells and coarse gravel at 12. A ship approaching a coast in fog and thick weather, unable to see anything, could sound its way in with the lead line, matching the depth and the bottom character against what the chart predicted, and thereby establish its position with a confidence that no astronomical observation could have provided in those conditions. You were not seeing where you were. You were feeling where you were, through a rope, through the fat at the end of a lead weight, through the texture and colour and composition of material lifted from the floor of the sea. Different parts of the ocean had different seafloors, the product of different geological histories and different sediment inputs. The sandy bottom off the Carolinas was different from the muddy bottom off the Mississippi Delta, which was different from the coral rubble of the Bahamas and the limestone dust of certain Caribbean passages. An experienced navigator who had sounded a particular area before knew what to expect from the lead, and a surprise, a bottom that did not match the expectation, told him he was somewhere other than where he thought. The world was speaking to him through the soles of his ship, through the material brought up from the bottom of the sea. All he had to do was listen. And what the ocean told him, in colour and depth and bottom composition and current and smell and the living things that moved through it, was as important and as reliable as any piece of wood or brass the carpenter had made. The birds especially. Pirate navigators knew the birds the way a farmer knows the weather signs in the sky. They knew which species indicated what, which behaviours meant what, which direction to watch when they saw a certain kind of bird at a certain time of day. And this knowledge was passed between generations of sailors with the same seriousness as the knowledge of instruments and charts. The most reliable of all bird-based navigation tricks, and the one that survived in the sailing literature longest, was based on the behaviour of a single family of seabirds. The frigate bird. You may know it by another name, the man-o'-war bird, and the name gives you a sense of its character. It is a large, dramatic creature with a wingspan that can reach 7 feet, a long, deeply forked tail that makes it unmistakable in the air, and a style of flying that is arrestingly beautiful, all long languid glides and sudden precise manoeuvres. Frigate birds spend their days far out at sea, soaring on thermal currents with their narrow wings held out flat, scanning the water below for fish. They are kleptoparasites, meaning that a great deal of what they eat they steal from other birds, harassing boobies and tropic birds into dropping their catches and then snatching the food from the air before it hits the water. It is a living. But frigate birds cannot land on water. Their plumage is not waterproof. If a frigate bird settled on the ocean surface, it would get wet, and a wet frigate bird cannot take off again. They are completely dependent on dry land to roost and to nest, so every frigate bird you see in the open ocean must, before darkness falls, return to land. Without exception, every single time. Think about what that means for navigation. In the late afternoon, as the sun begins to drop toward the western horizon, frigate birds start heading home. If you are within 100 miles of land, perhaps more, and you watch which direction the frigate birds are flying as the day ends, you will see them converging on one general heading. The direction toward which they fly as the light fades is the direction of land. Their course home is a compass bearing for you, free, with no instruments required. This trick was cited again and again in the sailing literature of the age of exploration and the age of piracy. Christopher Columbus noted the behaviour of birds in his log from 1492, and used the flight direction of a flock of birds to make the navigational decision that may have saved his first voyage. When he was still 3 weeks from landfall, discouraged, facing a near mutinous crew who wanted to turn back, he saw birds flying southwest in the evening. He changed course to follow them. Land appeared within days. The birds were right. Other species operated on similar principles. Boobies, those famously trusting and unafraid seabirds that would land on a ship and look at the crew with apparent curiosity, fed at sea and roosted on land. They flew out in the morning and returned in the evening. Their direction of evening flight pointed at their nesting islands. Tropic birds, with their long elegant trailing tail feathers, did the same. Terns, which preferred to roost on land but fed at sea, could often be seen in morning flights away from their roosts and evening flights back toward them. But the knowledge went beyond which direction the birds were flying. It extended to which species of bird was present, and what that told you about where you were. certain seabird species rarely ventured more than a certain distance from land. If you were seeing small land birds, swallows or hawks or warblers, far out at sea, they had been blown there by wind, and the wind that blew them came from land, which meant land was upwind of you, within the range that a small bird could be carried, which was typically 50 miles or less. The presence of these accidental offshore wanderers was directional information. The albatross, by contrast, indicated the absolute opposite. Albatrosses spend years at sea without ever touching land. They sleep on the water surface. They drink seawater through a special salt-filtering mechanism in their nostrils. They range across enormous tracts of the open ocean without ever needing a coast. If you were seeing albatrosses in large numbers, you were in deep open ocean, far from anything. The albatross was a negative navigation indicator. It told you what was not nearby. Petrels and shearwaters occupied the middle ground, and the most knowledgeable navigators used individual species as precise geographical markers. Certain petrels nested on specific island groups and were almost never seen elsewhere. A navigator who could make a reliable species identification, who knew that the bird sitting on the water 30 feet off the port bow was a species that nested only in one particular island chain, had established his position in a way no compass bearing could have given him. The bird was a geographic pin on the map of his memory. Fish species carried different kinds of information. Bonito, that swift and beautiful cousin of the tuna, followed the edges of major current systems. Bonito at the bow often meant you were near the boundary between two different bodies of water, which in the Atlantic usually meant you were near the Gulf Stream or some similar current edge. Flying fish, those miraculous creatures that erupted from the water in shining arcs and glided on their enlarged fin wings for 50 meters or more before slipping back in, were indicators of warm tropical water. Their presence confirmed that you had reached the tropics. Their disappearance as you moved into higher latitudes was a signal that you had left them. Dolphins changed their behavior near land in ways that experienced sailors learnt to read. In open ocean, dolphins accompanied ships with what appeared to be genuine playful interest, riding the bow wave, leaping out of the wash at the stern, working in apparent coordination with no particular urgency. In coastal waters, near feeding grounds, near the edges of banks where the seafloor shallowed, dolphins fed more purposefully, their movements were more directed, their schools organized differently. The behavioral shift was subtle, but to someone who had spent years watching dolphins, it was a change that said, "This is different water." There was one more category of living navigational indicator that is perhaps the most surprising of all. Insects. Land insects, the small flying kind, were sometimes carried out to sea by offshore winds. Mosquitoes and gnats and small beetles, the kinds of creatures you would only expect to find on land, were occasionally found aboard ships dozens of miles at sea, blown there by a land breeze in the preceding hours. Sailors who knew this, and experienced sailors did know it, could use the presence of insects to sense nearby land even in complete darkness or thick fog, when nothing could be seen. The cloud of small insects hitting the ship and crawling on the rigging was a strong indicator that land was less than 20 or 30 miles upwind. Even more specifically, in the Caribbean, there were fireflies. On warm, still nights, when the land breeze carried air gently offshore, fireflies had been reported by sailors as much as 15 or 20 miles out to sea. Small, blinking greenish lights, not stars, not too high up, blinking irregularly on and off just above the surface of the water. A navigator who saw what appeared to be very low stars blinking in the darkness, and who was an experienced Caribbean sailor, was not confused for long. Fireflies meant land was close. Follow the blinks back upwind, and you were going home. Among all these methods, all these skills, all these accumulated arts of reading the ocean and the sky and the creatures that lived in and above them, one kind of knowledge stood above the rest in importance. And it was the knowledge that lived in a single person's head. The knowledge of specific places. Not general principles. Not universal techniques. Specific, local, hard-earned, personal knowledge of particular waters. Here is something that might genuinely surprise you. In many ways, the most important person on a pirate ship was not the captain. The captain was powerful. The captain made decisions about where to raid and when to fight and how to negotiate with other crews. The captain was the visible authority, the face of the ship, the name that other ships would eventually fear or respect or both. Captains were important. But captains could be replaced. In the pirate world especially, where crews operated on a more democratic basis than naval ships, a captain could be voted out, replaced by someone the crew trusted more. It happened regularly. Captains came and went. But the navigator, the pilot, the man who carried the knowledge of where the ship was and how to get it safely wherever it needed to go, could almost never be replaced. Because what he carried in his head and nowhere else. That knowledge had taken a decade or more to accumulate. You could not hire it from a stranger on a dock. You could not learn it from a book in a week or a month. It was built from years of repeated voyages over the same waters, from the experience of older men who had sailed those waters before him, from failures and recoveries, and the slow accretion of detail that turned a generic ocean chart into a personal living map of exactly where things were and how they behaved. The most valuable crew member on many pirate voyages was the navigator, and experienced pirates knew this and treated him accordingly, which is to say they both relied on him completely and were sometimes uncomfortably aware that their lives were entirely in his hands. This was so well understood in the golden age of piracy that pirates who captured merchant ships sometimes made a specific and deliberate calculation. The cargo on the captured vessel might be worth a certain sum. The navigator of that vessel might be worth more. Not as a hostage for ransom, as a professional whose skills could be put to immediate use. There are documented accounts from the early 1700s of pirates who captured a merchantman, stripped her of everything valuable, released the captain and most of the crew, and then presented the navigator with a choice. Join us willingly, or be set adrift on a raft and take your chances. Many navigators, faced with the raft, found that their principles on the subject of piracy were somewhat flexible. The navigator's knowledge was of two fundamental kinds. The first was the general knowledge we have been discussing, the celestial navigation and the dead reckoning and the reading of the sky and ocean. This was, in theory, learnable from books and teachers and practice, and the more studious sort of navigator did supplement his practical experience with reading. There were published navigation manuals from the early 1600s onwards. There were tables and guides and explanations of instruments. But the second kind of knowledge was not learnable from any book that existed. It was local knowledge. Knowledge of specific places, specific passages, specific hazards and channels and anchorages and tides. And this was the knowledge that was most jealously guarded, most carefully held, most reluctantly shared. Local knowledge meant knowing the exact line of the channel through a reef that looked impassable to anyone who did not know it. Knowing where the spring tide flooded a particular lagoon entrance to make it usable, when at other times it was too shallow. Knowing where the freshwater stream ran into the sea on the north side of a particular small island, and that the stream was invisible from offshore but you could smell it from 3 miles out on the right wind. Knowing that the current around a particular headland set hard to the east in the afternoon and slacked in the early morning hours. Knowing where the sandbar was and where it had shifted since the last voyage. Knowing that the soundings on the chart were wrong. That the chart said 12 fathoms but the reality was 8, and that the discrepancy was explained by the chart being copied from a chart made by someone who had sounded the wrong part of the bay. This knowledge was almost never written down completely. It lived in the navigator's memory, in the personal shorthand of his own accumulated observations. It was transmitted orally, from experienced navigator to apprentice, in the same way that a master tradesperson teaches an apprentice the 1,000 small things that cannot be found in any manual. You showed them, you told them, you pointed and said, "Remember this," because one day your life and the lives of everyone on this ship will depend on whether you remember it. The physical documents that did attempt to record local navigational knowledge were called rutters, The word comes from the French routier, meaning road guide or route book, and from the Portuguese roteiro, which meant roughly the same thing. A rutta was a handwritten compilation of sailing directions for a specific body of water, assembled over time by a navigator who had travelled those waters repeatedly and had written down what he learned. A rutta might describe a harbour approach. When you sight the twin peaks of the eastern hill, come in from the northeast, keeping the eastern peak just open of the western one. Then bear south until the bottom comes up at 5 fathoms and turn to anchor in 4 fathoms on a sandy bottom. A rutta might describe a danger. At 3 leagues south of the cape there lies a sunken rock that shows only at the lowest spring tides. Always pass it to the westward, keeping a good cable's length between you and the kelp that marks it. A rutta described which currents to expect at which seasons in which passages. It described what the weather was likely to do at different times of year in specific locations. It described the smell of the land near a particular coast and what birds you would see approaching a particular island group. Think about what it took to compile a document like that. Not a single voyage. Not 2. A rutta of genuine value represented years, sometimes decades, of accumulated observation. The navigator who built it had sailed the same waters over and over, in different seasons, in different weather conditions, noting what changed and what stayed the same, correcting earlier entries when he found they were wrong, adding new information when he encountered something he had not seen before. It was a life's work, sometimes literally. And it was personal in a way that made it both extremely valuable and extremely fragile. If the man who wrote it died, took the manuscript to the bottom with his ship, or simply declined to share it, the knowledge it represented might vanish with him. This vulnerability was understood, and it shaped the way navigational knowledge was transmitted in ways that went beyond just the written rutta. The most important transmission was always oral, one sailor to another, face to face, over the course of a shared voyage. An experienced pilot who took on an apprentice, a young man who showed the right quality of attention, the right kind of intelligence and memory and willingness to learn, would talk to that apprentice constantly. Not in formal lessons, not as a structured teaching program, just in the natural course of the voyage. Come and look at this. You see how the water has changed colour? That colour means the bank is nearby. Come and smell this wind. That smell is vegetation. That particular green smell is a rainforest coast, and that means we are closer to land than our dead reckoning says we should be. Come and watch these birds. At this time of day, flying in that direction, what do they tell you? And the apprentice would answer. And sometimes the answer was right, and then the pilot would say nothing except perhaps a small nod. And sometimes the answer was wrong, and the pilot would explain why, once, clearly, and not again. Because in that world, if you needed to be told a thing twice, you were probably not going to survive long enough to need to know it at all. The knowledge accumulated over years of this, and when the apprentice became the pilot and took on his own apprentice, the chain continued. The same observations, the same skills, the same methods, passed from generation to generation in an unbroken living chain of expertise that stretched back to the earliest days of Atlantic sailing. Some of what those navigators knew came ultimately from indigenous populations who had been navigating those waters for centuries before any European ship arrived. The Caribbean pilots who helped Spanish navigators find the channels through the Florida Strait had learned those channels from their fathers and their fathers' fathers. The knowledge did not care about who had first developed it. It cared only about being accurate and being passed on. Ruttas were invaluable documents. They were also deeply personal. A navigator's rutta was written in his own shorthand, in his own abbreviations, in his own reference points and landmarks that meant something to him but were cryptic to anyone else. Sometimes this was deliberate, to make the document useless to anyone who might steal it. Sometimes it was simply the way a person's notes always are, full of private meanings that are clear to the person who wrote them and opaque to everyone else. A rutta in someone else's handwriting, full of someone else's local references and coded descriptions, was often nearly useless without the navigator who had written it to explain it, which is precisely why pirates who captured a rudder of genuine value would go to considerable lengths to also secure the pilot who had written it. The document and the mind that could interpret it were, together, the prize. Separately, they were much less useful. The Spanish were acutely aware of this. The Spanish colonial empire in the Americas depended on the ability to navigate safely between Spain and the Caribbean and Mexico and Peru, to bring silver back across the Atlantic, to supply the colonies, to keep the whole vast operation functioning. Their charts and their pilots were strategic assets of the highest order. Sharing Spanish navigational knowledge with foreign powers was explicitly prohibited by Spanish law. A Spanish pilot who fell into English or Dutch or French hands was questioned extensively, sometimes under considerable pressure, about sea routes, about the positions of reefs and shoals, about the depths of channels and the locations of safe anchorages. The knowledge in a pilot's head was worth more, in strategic terms, than a holdful of silver. Pirates understood this completely. Some of the most deliberate and carefully planned raids of the Golden Age targeted not treasure chests, but knowledge. And the most successful pirate captains were, almost without exception, navigators of considerable skill themselves. Bartholomew Roberts, who may have taken more prizes than any pirate in history, was a trained second mate before he turned to piracy. Being second mate on a merchant ship in that era was, among other things, a navigational role. Roberts understood celestial observations and dead reckoning and coastal pilotage at a professional level. When he was captured by the pirate Howell Davis in 1719 and offered the choice between piracy and a plank, Davis knew he was getting not just another pair of hands, but a navigator of genuine competence. Roberts's skill at finding his way across the Atlantic and around the coasts of Africa and the Americas was a significant part of what made his subsequent career so extraordinary. William Dampier was a different kind of navigator, or rather an additional kind. Dampier was a buccaneer in the last decades of the 1600s, but he was also a naturalist, an observer, a writer of uncommon curiosity and skill. He sailed 3 times around the world. He survived shipwreck in the Indian Ocean. He spent years in environments that killed most of the men who accompanied him. And through all of it, he wrote down everything he noticed. The movements of currents, the behaviour of winds at different times of year in different parts of the ocean, the character of water in different regions, the birds and fish and floating debris that could tell an attentive sailor where he was. His published books were read by every serious navigator of the following century. Dampier was not a pirate in the manner of Roberts or Blackbeard. He was something more unusual, a man who went to sea partly in order to understand it, and who transformed his understanding into knowledge that other people could use. Stead Bonnet was the inverse of all this. Bonnet was a prosperous Barbados plantation owner who one day decided to become a pirate, reportedly to escape a difficult domestic situation, and who bought a ship and hired a crew without any meaningful understanding of how ships or navigation worked. He was, in navigational terms, a disaster. He could not find his way. He did not know how to take a latitude. He did not know how to use a compass correctly. He had to rely on members of his crew who had actual seafaring skills, and his early voyages were characterized by arriving in wrong places and needing his crew to explain to him where he actually was. He eventually attached himself to Blackbeard, partly because Blackbeard possessed, among other things, the navigational competence that Bonnet completely lacked and could not acquire quickly enough. The story of Stede Bonnet is, among other things, a story of what happened to a pirate operation built on everything except the specific technical knowledge that piracy most fundamentally required. Blackbeard, whose real name was most likely Edward Teach, was the opposite of Bonnet in this respect. Blackbeard operated primarily in the shallow coastal waters of the American South and the Caribbean, and his most powerful advantage was his intimate knowledge of those waters. The Outer Banks of North Carolina, the shallow inlets and shifting sandbars between the sea and the coastal sounds, the passages that were navigable at high water and blocked at low tide, these were his territory, He knew them the way a man knows his own house in the dark, and the Royal Navy ships that might otherwise have pursued him into those waters could not follow, because those waters would ground a deep-drafted naval frigate. The same shoals that protected Blackbeard killed his pursuers. The navigator's knowledge is a weapon, the water as a wall that only the well-informed could pass through safely. You need to understand something about the Atlantic Ocean in the early 18th century. It was a more predictable place than you might expect, not safer, not more forgiving. The sea was as violent and as random in 1710 as it is today. But in the sense of its broad patterns, its dominant winds and its seasonal rhythms, the Atlantic was a place that rewarded patient and careful observation with something close to predictability. And the navigators who had studied it long enough and remembered what they had learned could use that predictability to plan voyages across thousands of miles of water with reasonable confidence about what they would encounter. The key to this was the trade winds. In the North Atlantic, between roughly 5 and 25 degrees of latitude north of the equator, the prevailing winds blew from the northeast with a steadiness that was unlike anything northern European sailors had previously experienced. These were not the variable and shifting winds of the English Channel or the North Sea, changing direction every few hours, requiring constant adjustment and attention. These were consistent, reliable, practically industrial winds that blew day after day, week after week, from approximately the same direction at approximately the same speed. Sailors called them the trade winds because they were useful to trade, predictable enough to plan commercial voyages around. A ship that found the northeast trades and held them could cross the Atlantic from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean without significantly adjusting its sails for weeks. This is how Christopher Columbus made his first crossing in 1492. He sailed south from Spain to the Canary Islands, waited for the trades to establish themselves under his keel, turned west, and let the wind carry him across. The crossing took 33 days and was, by the standards of the time, remarkably smooth. The trade winds gave him the Atlantic, and 200 years later they gave the pirates the same gift. The return voyage was different. Going back from the Caribbean to Europe meant going northeast, which meant going into the trades, sailing against the wind, and that was a struggle. Columbus knew enough not to try to beat back into the trades. He sailed north from the Caribbean into higher latitudes where the winds blew from the southwest instead of the northeast, the westerlies, the prevailing mid-latitude winds that pushed ships toward Europe. This pattern, south in the trades, west to America, north to the westerlies, east back to Europe, became the fundamental routing of the entire Atlantic trade. And pirates, who preyed on that trade, had to understand the routing completely in order to position themselves effectively within it. A pirate captain who understood the trade wind system knew where merchant ships would be and when. He knew which routes they would take and why. He could station himself on a particular stretch of ocean and know with reasonable certainty that ships laden with particular cargoes from particular ports would pass through that stretch at particular times of year. The wind system was a timetable. Reading it was intelligence work. But before you could use the trades, you had to find them. Coming south from European latitudes, a ship would first encounter the variable winds of the mid-latitudes, then the horse latitudes, a belt of unreliable light winds centered around 30 degrees north, and then, somewhere south of that, the trades would come in. The moment of their arrival was felt before it was calculated. The air got warmer. The character of the wind changed, settling from variable shifts into something more consistent, coming from a steadier direction at a steadier strength. The sea surface changed too, the chop organising itself into a pattern that came from one direction rather than from several. Experienced sailors felt when they had entered the trade wind belt and adjusted their sails to make the most of it. The worst thing in the trade wind world was the zone in between. Between the northern trade winds and the southern trade winds, running roughly from 5 degrees south to 5 degrees north, was a belt of weather that every sailor dreaded. They called it the doldrums, and the word has since become part of the English language as a metaphor for a state of depression and stagnation. which tells you something about the experience of being in them. In the doldrums, the trade winds from north and south converged and largely cancelled each other out. The result was irregular, unpredictable, variable weather, characterized by days of dead calm interspersed with sudden violent squalls that came without warning and sometimes lasted only minutes. On a dead calm day in the doldrums, the ocean was a mirror. The sails hung slack against the masts with not enough wind to fill them. The ship sat still on the glassy surface, creaking slightly in the long swell, going nowhere. The equatorial sun overhead was almost vertical, beating straight down with no shade anywhere on the deck. The air was thick and hot and wet, like breathing warm water. Everything metal was too hot to touch. The crew was listless, irritable, short of water, because water was always in short supply, and the doldrums extended the voyage by days or weeks. And in the evenings, sometimes, a violent squall would sweep through with no warning, bringing torrential rain and fierce gusts that had the crew scrambling to reduce sail before the masts came down, and then passing in 20 minutes and leaving the air heavy and still again. Getting through the doldrums required patience and constant attention to the sky. The navigators who fared best were those who learned to read the earliest signs of wind. A darkening line on the horizon. The first faint ruffling of the glassy surface from a direction that suggested a puff of air was coming. The movement of clouds in the upper atmosphere that suggested the general circulation was shifting. Cat's paws. Those small circular ripple patterns where a gust is just touching the water, each one a potential first puff of a breeze that might or might not develop into something useful. You watched for these things with the intensity of someone who had a very good reason to want to move. Cloud reading was a separate skill that overlapped with wind reading and weather reading, and it produced some of the most practically useful information a navigator could have, including the most important trick for finding land when you could not yet see it. The basic principle is this. Islands have terrain. Mountains, hills, volcanic cones, even just the modest elevation of a low coral island above the level of the sea. When warm moist air moving in from the ocean hits elevated land, it is forced upward. As it rises it cools, and as it cools, the water vapour in it condenses into cloud. The result is that islands in warm moist climates almost always have clouds forming and persisting above them, even on days when the surrounding ocean is relatively clear. The cloud forms where the land is and nowhere else, because the land is what forces the air to rise, and the cloud stays more or less in place above the land while other clouds drift past it on the wind, because the mechanism generating it, the land, does not move. A navigator on the open ocean, scanning the horizon in a clear sky, who spots a single cumulus cloud sitting low on the horizon in one direction and not moving as other clouds move, not drifting with the wind the way free clouds drift, but staying in essentially the same place relative to the ship as the hours pass. That cloud is almost certainly being generated by land beneath it. Land too low on the horizon to see yet, below the curvature of the earth from where you are standing, but announcing its presence through this cloud that it is generating above it. The cloud is the land's messenger, sent out ahead to tell you where to go. This was a technique used by navigators across the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean wherever islands lay below the horizon and their cloud caps rose above it. Polynesian navigators, the most sophisticated traditional wayfinders in history, had developed this method to an extraordinary degree over thousands of years of Pacific island hopping. Atlantic pirates used it in a rougher form, but used it nonetheless, and it worked. The colour under a cloud carried additional information. A tropical lagoon, the shallow enclosed water inside a coral atoll, reflects light differently from the deep blue of the open ocean. The lagoon's bottom, typically white sand or light-coloured coral, bounces sunlight back up through the turquoise shallow water, and some of that reflected light reaches the underside of any cloud sitting above. The underside of the cloud picks up a faint greenish tinge, the reflected colour of the lagoon below. Navigators who knew this looked for that greenish tinge under an isolated cloud as a secondary confirmation. Green tinge under the cloud meant not just land, but a lagoon, which in the Caribbean or Pacific often meant a coral atoll with a sheltered anchorage inside. High clouds, the thin wispy streaks of ice crystal cirrus that sat at the very top of the atmosphere, were weather predictors rather than land indicators. In the northern hemisphere, cirrus clouds appearing from the northwest or west and thickening over the course of a day typically indicated an approaching weather system, a depression moving in that would bring wind and rain within the next day or two. Experienced navigators who saw this pattern made their preparations in advance, secured loose gear, checked the rigging, perhaps shortened sail before the wind strengthened, found a good position to ride out what was coming, rather than being caught unprepared. The clouds were giving them time, hours of warning, sometimes a full day or more, to get ready for what was approaching from beyond their horizon. Hurricane signs in the Caribbean were a particular study, because the consequences of being caught unprepared in a tropical hurricane were almost certainly fatal. The distinctive warning signs of an approaching hurricane were known from long experience. A long swell arriving from the south or southeast days before any visible storm. The sea surface showing this regular deep ocean motion, while the sky above was still clear. A peculiar milky haze in the atmosphere, diffusing the sunlight. An unusual coloration at sunrise or sunset, reds and golds of exceptional intensity produced by the altered atmosphere of a distant massive storm. And a barometric pressure reading, for those who had a mercury barometer, that was falling slowly and then rapidly. The combination of these signs gave experienced sailors time to run for shelter, to find a harbour or a protected anchorage, to take in sail and prepare for what was coming. The knowledge of these signs had been bought with lives, with ships and crews lost in hurricanes that arrived without warning in the early years of Caribbean exploration, and it was passed on with the solemnity appropriate to that price. Reading the shifting direction of the wind was perhaps the most continuously practiced skill of all, because the wind was the ship's engine and every change in it was immediately felt. A backing wind, one whose direction shifted counterclockwise as you watched it, in the northern hemisphere almost always indicated that a low-pressure system, a depression, was approaching. The wind would first come from the south, then shift to south-southeast, then southeast. And if the depression was coming directly at you, it might continue shifting further east and northeast as the centre passed. This sequence of wind shifts was a readable story. A navigator who felt the wind backing during the night and woke the captain to say that weather was coming was usually right. A veering wind, shifting clockwise, generally indicated improvement. A southwest wind veering to west to northwest in the North Atlantic was the signature of a high-pressure system moving in, bringing clearer skies, steadier winds, and the kind of settled weather that made navigation easier and life at sea more tolerable. The wind was always telling you something, and the navigator's job included listening to it constantly, not just recording it in the log, but genuinely interpreting it, asking what it meant, what it would become, and what that meant for where the ship was going. And if the wind was the ship's engine, then fog was perhaps the most feared thing it could encounter. Not the drama of a storm with its fierce, visible threat. Fog was quiet. Fog was subtle. Fog took away the information that navigators depended on most, the visual information, the ability to see the horizon, to see the sky, to see anything beyond a few yards of grey, damp nothingness. And in fog near a coast, near a reef, near any hazard, the consequences of being surprised could be immediate and final. Sailors had developed specific habits for fog, learned from bitter experience and from the accounts of men who had survived it. The first was to reduce speed, sometimes drastically. A ship moving at 8 knots in clear weather would slow to 2 or 3 knots in dense fog near a coast. Because the difference between sighting a rock at half a mile and being able to turn away from it in time, and sighting it at 50 yards when it was already too late, was precisely a matter of how fast you were going. Slower meant more time meant survival. The second habit was continuous sounding with the lead line. If you were near coastal waters, you sounded every half hour, sometimes every quarter hour. The depth was your compass in fog, your sense of where you were and how close you were to danger. A suddenly decreasing depth was a shout from the sea floor, "Stop, or you are about to die." A depth that matched your chart was a quiet reassurance. "Continue with caution, you are where you think you are." The leadsman stood at the bow in the fog, feeling the line run through his hands, calling the marks back to the navigator in a low voice, and the whole ship waited on his readings with a collective held breath. The third thing navigators learned was to listen. Sound travelled through fog in strange ways, sometimes further than expected, sometimes with its direction distorted by the way fog reflected and absorbed it. Surf on rocks, the low boom and hiss of waves on a coast, could be heard well before the rocks themselves appeared. The foghorn calls of other ships, which were beginning to be used by this era in some busy waters, could indicate the presence of dangerous traffic. And the echo of the ship's own sounds, a shout, a bell, a gun fired as a signal, could sometimes reveal the presence and the approximate distance of a nearby surface by the way the sound bounced back. Sailors pressed into service as fog signals used bronze bells and sometimes the ship's cannon, firing and then listening for an echo that might tell them how far they were from land. It was crude, it was approximate, it sometimes worked. For all the skill and all the knowledge and all the accumulated craft we have been describing, navigation in the golden age of piracy went wrong. Often, sometimes catastrophically. The skills were real and the knowledge was real and they worked most of the time. But the ocean is larger than any skill, and the errors that accumulate in a dead reckoning calculation over 3 weeks at sea could sometimes place a ship in the wrong part of the ocean by 100 miles or more, and 100 miles in the wrong direction was sometimes the difference between open water and a reef. The most consequential navigational disaster of the early 18th century happened to someone who was not a pirate, but whose catastrophic failure had consequences that reached into every ship that sailed the ocean for the next half-century. On the night of October 22nd, 1707, a British Royal Navy fleet of 21 ships was sailing northeast toward England after months of operations in the Mediterranean. They were approaching home waters. The fleet had been at sea for several days in poor weather, overcast skies that had prevented any celestial observations, and their navigators had been relying entirely on dead reckoning to estimate their position. The officers of the various ships had actually held a conference earlier that day to compare their dead reckoning calculations. Most of them agreed they were safely southwest of the Scilly Isles, the island group lying off the southwestern tip of England. They believed they had sea room to spare. They did not. The accumulated errors of days of dead reckoning without a celestial fix had placed them far to the northeast of where they thought they were. They were not safely clear of the Scilly Isles. They were heading directly toward them. In the dark, in a rising sea, with no warning, 4 ships struck the rocks. The flagship, the Association, hit the outer Gilstone Reef and sank in less than 4 minutes. The Eagle and the Romney went down almost as fast. A 4th ship was lost shortly after. Between 1,500 and 2,000 sailors died. The admiral commanding the fleet, Sir Cloudesley Shovel, was washed ashore on the island of St. Mary's and died of his injuries, or, as some later accounts claimed, was helped to die by an islander who wanted the emerald ring on his finger. The disaster at Scilly shocked Britain and shocked Europe, and demonstrated in the most brutal imaginable terms that without a reliable method of determining longitude, ships and men would keep dying on well-charted rocks that everyone knew existed, and nobody could reliably locate themselves relative to. The British Parliament responded by establishing the Longitude Act of 1714, offering a prize of £20,000, an enormous sum for anyone who could solve the problem. It was that prize that John Harrison eventually won with his marine chronometer decades later, after 4 attempts that consumed most of his life. But the pirates navigating in those same years were dealing with precisely the same limitations as those Royal Navy ships. They had no more ability to precisely determine longitude than Chauvel's fleet did. Their advantage, in many cases, was something entirely different. They knew specific waters with an intimacy that their opponents often lacked. They operated in familiar territory. They knew which reefs were where, which channels were navigable at which states of the tide, which passages could be managed by a shallow draft pirate sloop that would ground a deep-hulled naval frigate. There is a detail about the Scilly disaster that tends to get lost in the broad summary of the event, and it matters enormously for understanding the human experience of navigating without reliable longitude. The senior officers of that fleet had compared their dead reckoning estimates earlier on the day of the disaster. They had consulted with each other, they had pooled their calculations, and they had reached a consensus that they were safe. Multiple experienced navigators, working independently from the same shared departure point and the same general log records, had each arrived at a position estimate that placed them well clear of the rocks. The consensus was wrong, and the fact that it was reached by consensus made it, paradoxically, more dangerous rather than less. Because the agreement among experienced men created a confidence that should not have been there. None of them had pressed the question hard enough. None of them had said aloud, "We cannot be certain, and our uncertainty is large enough to be fatal." The social pressure of professional agreement, the reluctance to be the one man who said, "Actually, I think we are all wrong," may have contributed to the silence that sent 2,000 men to the bottom. This is a lesson that navigators took from the disaster and discussed explicitly in the navigational writing of the following decades. Not just the technical lesson about longitude, though that was the most obvious, but the human lesson. The lesson about what happens when the need for certainty, the need to believe you know where you are, overrides the honest acknowledgement that you do not know with confidence. The navigator's greatest enemy was not ignorance, it was false confidence. It was the feeling of knowing that was built on insufficient evidence. Every experienced pilot who heard the story of Scilly understood it as a warning, not just about the limits of their instruments, but about the limits of their own minds. The human capacity to believe what is comfortable to believe, what fits the expected pattern, what confirms what the majority agrees on, that capacity is lethal at sea. And the best navigators learn to distrust it in themselves. Pirates who operated outside the military hierarchy that might have created the same pressure toward false consensus were sometimes actually better at this particular form of honesty. A pirate crew operated on the understanding that if the navigator was wrong, everyone died, and no one would hesitate to point out that the navigator might be wrong. There was no rank to protect, no professional courtesy to extend, no admiralty career to safeguard. If the man with the cross-staff seemed uncertain, someone would say so loudly, and the navigator had to either defend his position estimate with good arguments or admit that he was less sure than he wanted to be. This made pirate navigation, in a strange way, more epistemically honest than naval navigation. The democratic culture of pirate ships, which we usually think of as lawless and chaotic, produced a navigational culture in which bad estimates had a harder time surviving unchallenged. The consequences of being wrong were not always immediate and dramatic in the manner of Scilly. More often they were slow and cumulative. A ship that was 50 miles further west than its navigator thought was not immediately in danger. But it was 50 miles further west than its water supply calculation assumed. It was 50 miles further west than the wind patterns the navigator was expecting. It was 50 miles further west than the anchorage he was aiming for on the chart. The error compounded, the small mismatch between expectation and reality grew, and 3 days later, when the water barrels ran lower than they should have, when the island that should have appeared on the horizon had not appeared, when the wind had a quality that did not match what the navigator expected for this latitude and this season, all of those things that felt slightly wrong were expressions of the original positional error, now grown from 50 miles to something larger, and now starting to affect the lives and the health and the morale of the crew. And yet. The thing that these navigators accomplished, in vessel after vessel, voyage after voyage, was genuinely extraordinary. We know they succeeded because the record of the golden age of piracy is a record of ships that found their targets, of raids on specific ports at specific times, of fleets that assembled at appointed places, of individual sloops that crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and found small islands in the middle of it. The failures happened. The ships that were lost, the crews that died, the voyages that ended badly. They happened. But they were the exception. The remarkable fact is not that navigation sometimes failed. The remarkable fact is how reliably it succeeded. Men with wooden sticks and knotted ropes and handfuls of tallow-packed lead, men reading birds and smelling currents and tasting the water and watching the clouds, men building their position estimates from dozens of small, imperfect observations layered carefully on top of each other. These men crossed the ocean, they found what they were looking for, and they came home. That is the final truth about pirate navigation, the one that all the skill and all the knowledge and all the accumulated craft points toward. It worked. Not because it was perfect, not because it removed all uncertainty, but because the people using it were intelligent, observant, experienced, and humble enough, in the best cases, to know the limits of what they knew and to keep learning anyway. Every voyage was a lesson. Every arrival or failure to arrive was information. Every bird noticed, and every colour shift in the water, and every sound in the fog, and every unexpected current added to the navigator's internal model of the world made it a little more accurate, made the next voyage a little more likely to end well. They were building knowledge in the only way knowledge has ever truly been built, slowly, carefully, from the accumulation of experience and the honest confrontation with the gap between what you expected and what you found. And then they brought that knowledge home. They carried it in their heads back across the ocean, the same way they carried themselves home, one careful observation at a time. The Bahama Islands are perhaps the best example of this. The Great Bahama Bank, the enormous shallow platform on which most of the Bahamas sit, is dotted with cays and reefs and shifting sandbars and passages that change character with every hurricane season. In 1710, this area was only partially and unreliably charted. Naval captains who tried to follow pirate ships into the Bahamas did so at genuine peril to their ships. But the pirate pilots who operated out of Nassau knew those waters at the level of personal experience. They knew which cut was deep enough for which draft at which state of tide. They knew where the water turned dangerous colour and where it was deceptively calm above a coral head. They navigated the Bahamas partly by colour and partly by depth sounding with the lead line and partly by the accumulated memory of 100 previous transits. The lead line was one of the oldest navigational instruments in existence. It was a rope marked at regular intervals with a weight of lead at the end. You dropped it over the side, let it go to the bottom, and counted the marks as the rope ran down. Each mark represented a fathom, which was 6 feet, a distance roughly equal to the arm span of an adult man, and is in fact derived from that measurement. 2 fathoms was 12 feet, which is shallow enough to be dangerous for a large ship. It is also where the phrase Mark Twain comes from, the steamboat call of the leadsman measuring the depth of a river by the mark 2 fathoms. The writer who took Samuel Clemens as his pen name had spent time as a Mississippi River pilot, and he chose that name. But the lead line did something beyond simply measuring depth. The lead weight at the end was hollow at the bottom, and the hollow was packed with tallow, with animal fat. When the lead struck the seafloor and was pulled back up, material from the bottom stuck to the tallow. The navigator examined this material carefully. Was it sand? If so, what colour of sand? What texture? Was it mud? What kind of mud? Dark grey or light brown or blue-grey? Was it shell? What kind of shell? Were there small pebbles? What colour? Different seafloors in different parts of the ocean were composed of different materials, and these differences were recorded in the charts and rutters of experienced navigators. The charts of British waters from this era mark the seafloor composition everywhere they record depths, sandy bottom, muddy bottom, shell, fine grey sand, black mud, and so on. A ship approaching the English coast in fog and poor visibility could find its approximate position by sounding the depth and examining what the tallow brought up. Dark grey mud at 25 fathoms here, fine brown sand at 15 fathoms there. The seafloor was a map written in sediment, and a skilled navigator could read it as surely as he read the stars. Running aground was nonetheless a constant risk, because the Caribbean especially was full of reefs and banks that were poorly charted or completely uncharted, and because even the best dead reckoning could put you a few miles off on a dark night, when a few miles was all that stood between you and a coral wall. When a ship ran aground on sand in calm weather, there was sometimes hope. You moved everything heavy, cannon especially, to change the ship's trim and reduce the draft. You kedged off, rowing an anchor out ahead in a small boat, attaching the kedge anchor to a cable running back to the ship's capstan, and winching the ship painfully forward toward the anchor. You rocked the ship, setting the crew running rhythmically from side to side to work it free. It was exhausting work, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. In rough weather, on rock, the outcome was almost always the same. The hull was opened, the water came in, and everything depended on how close the nearest land was and how quickly the boats could be got away. Getting lost in fog was different from running aground because it was slower, more psychological, less immediate in its danger, but more insidious in its effect on the crew's minds. Fog removed vision without compensating with anything else. Sound became unreliable, reflecting off the fog and seeming to come from unexpected directions. The sound of surf that should be straight ahead sometimes sounded as if it were to the left. A headland that should be a mile away seemed, from its sound, to be further. The fog amplified uncertainty and muffled the ordinary sensory information that navigators used constantly. In fog near a coast, the protocol was to slow nearly to a stop, sound the depth every few minutes, post lookouts on the bow listening and smelling for surf, and proceed with the kind of exquisite caution that was very hard to maintain when you were tired and cold and had been in the fog for 12 hours. The psychological weight of navigational uncertainty was something that experienced sailors described, and that journals and logs from the era occasionally revealed between the formal entries. Days without a celestial fix, days of accumulating dead reckoning error, were days of quiet anxiety that sat behind everything else the ship was doing. The navigator knew, in a way he could not fully communicate to the captain without causing panic, that his estimate of position was becoming less and less trustworthy with each passing cloudy day. The number he put in the log for their latitude and longitude was his best estimate, but his best estimate was deteriorating. And the most experienced navigators were also the most honest with themselves about this, which made the anxiety more rather than less. But here is the thing that perhaps matters most, the thing that should be the lasting image of tonight, as your mind begins to soften and drift. For all these risks, for all the disasters and the catastrophes and the ships that ran aground and the crews that died, the remarkable truth about navigation in the golden age of piracy is how often it worked. How many voyages were completed successfully? How many specific islands were found in specific oceans by men using nothing but their own intelligence and the world around them? How many harbours were entered safely in darkness and in fog? How many merchant ships were correctly intercepted on exactly the sea lanes where they were expected? The tricks worked. The knowledge held. The skills were sufficient. Not always, not every time, but most of the time, in the hands of men who had spent years learning the ocean, they were enough. And now, as we reach the end of tonight's journey, I want you to do something for me. I want you to let go of everything you have heard. Not forget it, not put it away. Just let it settle. Let it sink down like something sinking slowly through clear, warm water, spiralling gently, no hurry, nothing to reach on the way down. Let it find its own level somewhere deep and quiet. And for just a moment, let the ocean be around you. Not the dangerous ocean, not the terrifying ocean of grounding reefs and moonless nights and water barrels running dry. The other ocean, the one that comes after the danger is past, after the navigator has done his calculations for the day and put away his instruments, after the watch has been set and the course is established and the ship is moving steadily on a line that someone knows to be correct. Imagine the sound of water against wood. That particular sound, the way water moves along the hull of a wooden ship, is almost exactly like breathing. It has a rhythm, a repetition. In and out, the water sliding and hissing and pushing away from the bow and closing behind the stern. The ship moves through the water and the water gives way and comes back together again, and this has been happening since the ship left port, and it will keep happening all through the night, whether you are awake or not. Imagine the stars above. If this were really the open Atlantic in 1712, they would be beyond anything you have seen. The Milky Way would be a river of silver. Orion would be rising in the east. Polaris would be sitting exactly where it always sits, exactly as many degrees above the horizon as you are north of the equator, steady and reliable as anything in this world, the universe holding still and vast while the little ship moves through a tiny corner of it. Someone on the watch is keeping an eye on Polaris, making sure the helmsman is holding the course, making sure the sails are drawing properly, making sure the ship is being cared for while everyone else rests. Someone is awake. Someone is paying attention. There is something deeply comforting about that image, I think. The idea of someone keeping watch, the idea that while you rest, while you sleep, someone is holding the course and keeping track and making sure you are going where you need to go. The navigator on his watch, his eyes moving between the compass and the sky, his hands warm in his coat, his mind running quietly through everything he knows about where they are and where they are going and how to get there safely. His job was to know, and because he knew, everyone else could rest. Your job tonight is much simpler than his was. Your job is just to rest. The calculations have been done for today. Whatever needed working out, you worked it out. Whatever decisions needed making, they have been made. The watch has been set. There is nothing left for you to figure out tonight, no horizon to measure. No question to answer that cannot wait until morning and the day after tomorrow and as long as it needs to wait. You got through today. You found your way through it. You are here. That is enough. Let your shoulders come down. All the way down, further than you think they can go. Let them drop. Let your hands unclench. Let your breath slow to whatever pace feels natural and easy. Let the weight of the day settle somewhere outside of you, not in your body, not in your chest or your jaw or your temples, but somewhere outside, somewhere that is not this quiet, comfortable place where you are lying right now. Think about those navigators, those remarkable human beings with their sun-darkened hands and their long memories, looking up at a sky full of stars and reading it like a letter written specifically for them by the universe. They crossed impossible distances with their eyes and their hands and their accumulated intelligence. They found small islands in the middle of enormous oceans. They read the ocean's colour and smell and temperature and the behaviour of birds and insects and currents and clouds. And they used all of it to know where they were. And they brought their crews home. And then they slept, just like you are going to do now. Under those same stars, on that same rocking ocean with the water making its breathing sound against the hull, they closed their eyes and they let go. They trusted the knowledge they had built over years to hold for the night. They trusted the watch to keep the course. They trusted the sea to be the sea, which it always was. The water is moving, the stars are holding still, the course is set. Polaris is exactly where it always is, a fixed point in the turning sky, patient and motionless and exactly the right distance above your horizon for exactly where you are. Someone is keeping the watch tonight. Someone is watching the course. You do not have to do that. You can rest. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.